Welcome, everybody. Nice to have a good crowd here. My name is Bob Moore, and I serve as the chair of the San Cap Resilience Steering Committee. And it's my honor to welcome you all here. We've had almost 250 people who registered tonight, so we may have some more folks coming for the next wave of the Vendor Expo after our talk tonight. I wanted to let you know we'll be recording this evening's session, and we'll post the video to our YouTube channel and send out an email letting you know that it's available. So that is coming. Just a couple of comments before I introduce our speaker for the evening. First of all, I want to thank our sponsors for this evening. The Charitable Foundation of the Islands Community Impact Fund has really made us able to coordinate and put this program together. And all of the vendors who are here tonight have been very generous in sponsoring the program this evening. Why don't we just give them all a round of applause? I'd like to give special recognition to a couple of them. First of all, Sam Bays from the Secure Flex Seal family of products. I met Sam through the previous floodplain manager at Sanibel. And he was instrumental in helping me find our speaker for this evening, which I think you'll find was a big contribution. So thanks to Sam for that. He's also one of our top sponsors this evening. And I want to acknowledge our second top sponsor, which is the folks from Surf Pro. So thanks to both of you all. And really all of our sponsors made generous donations to CFI. And all of the vendors that are here have a connection with the islands. We didn't send out like a public announcement, come to this expo. It was really a word of mouth invitation. So all these folks have done business with others on Sanibel, have come with some form of a reference. So we don't endorse anyone, but we do feel comfortable that you've got some valid folks to work with here. Now, one of the other things that the sponsorship money supported, in addition to this presentation tonight, was an opportunity for 4 people to receive a free 1-hour home consult by our speaker, introduced in a minute, Schwalls. And we did a drawing for that. So I want to announce the winners of those drawings. We decided to take 2 ground level homes and 2 elevated homes. And for the elevated homes, we did one that has storage and garage space underneath. But we also wanted to look at ground or elevated homes that had grandfathered finished space underneath. So those are the categories that we drew from. The ground level homes, Cheryl Steele and Darby Zurich. You guys here? No, okay, well, you'll get to meet Dell tomorrow. And then for the elevated homes, we've got Jim and Lori Rydell. You guys here? Yeah, there you are, great. And Bill Lahota, are you here, Bill? Congratulations on winning that. But I wanted to also tell the rest of you that everyone wins in this drawing, because we have one of our steering committee volunteers who's going to follow our consultant around to these consults, record them, and then convert the consults into case studies that we will then make available. So anyone who didn't win will still get the benefit of the coaching that that Dell's able to provide. So everybody wins in this contest. All right, a couple things here. San Cap Resilience. We're really focusing on 2 aspects of sort of complementary components of what resilience means. So adaptation, hardening our homes, hardening our businesses, hardening infrastructure, preparing for challenges that come with the changing climate. But it's also really important that whenever we talk about adaptation, to talk about how do we mitigate risks for the future in the same conversation. You and I and all of our global neighbors around the world we're putting 160 million tons of climate warming pollution into the atmosphere every 24 hours. That pollution is trapping heat. The hottest 3 years ever recorded have been the last 3 years. And the hottest 10 years before that were the 10 years previous. We're now seeing 4 times more extreme flood events in the US than we did just 40 years ago. When you look at storm events, we used to have in the 80s a $1 billion storm event every 40 days. Today, those $1 billion storm events adjusted for inflation are happening every 12 days. And we all know we're particularly susceptible to sea level rise here. We've had 7 or 8 inches of sea level rise just since the 1970s. And that rate of increase is increasing. So adaptation is important for the here and now, but we at some point adaptation will become insufficient if we also don't become a part of a broad solution to address the causes of climate change. Now, it's not surprising there's a lot of interest in this topic in the community. You know, we were hit with those 3 big flood events, storm surge events from Ian and Helene and Milton, and many people have also been getting flooded with king tides without a storm. We did a survey recently, probably a lot of you participated. We had over 1,000 respondents to our survey. And we asked the question, what would you like to learn more about? And you probably can't read the fine print over here, but over 60% of the respondents said learning about how to protect their homes from floodwaters was sort of their top interest. Incidentally, the second vote getter in that question was how to design a resilient landscape, which is going to be the topic of our next event that's coming up on April 15th. So let's talk about tonight, how it's going to go. The presentation is going to be an interview. So I'm going to sit down with Dal and go through some questions and allow him to sort of extemporaneously speak to the questions that I have for him. When I get to the end of my questions, we're going to open up for your questions. Okay, and there's a couple of ways that we'll be taking those questions. Many of you sent questions in advance, so I've got those and they're organized, and we'll get to the ones that Dale doesn't address directly in his responses. But if you have questions that come up tonight, there are index cards, and those are up on the registration table. But if you need one, raise your hand. We've got some people who are going to be available to pass those out. We also have an online tool that you can answer or ask questions right on your phone. And this QR code up here will get you there. I will tell you that there's a limitation to the online tool. It's a free software and only allows 50 users at a time. So if you get bumped off, that's why you can just ask for an index card. All right. So after the Q&A, we will have the vendors, the expo will be open again for you to go and speak with the folks in the back of the room. The flow of the conversation with Dale is going to start with the big picture, and we'll kind of work our way down into some details. Let me introduce our speaker this evening. Dale Schwalls is president of Schwalls Consulting, LLC, and an environmental engineer with 25 years of experience in floodplain management and water resources. He provides engineering and floodplain management solutions for local municipalities, state and federal agencies, and private entities. He specializes in conducting training around the country on the FEMA Elevation Certificate, supporting communities in improving their CRS and overall floodplain management programs, and tailoring local regulations to meet the community's specific needs and goals while protecting the natural and beneficial functions of floodplains. He serves as an expert legal witness on FEMA regulations and programs and has been the inland flooding subject matter expert for the Florida Commission on Hurricane Loss Projection Methodology since 2015. His background includes watershed and stormwater management, independent technical reviews of FEMA flood risk studies, and flood risk assessment, modeling, and mapping. Dale has been on the board of directors for the Florida Floodplain Managers Association since 2008, including serving as chair and vice chair. Served on the National Board of Directors for the Association of State Floodplain Managers from 2016 to 22, and is an associate with the ASFPM Foundation. He's a professional engineer in Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, and earned his certificate floodplain manager certified floodplain manager certification in 2003. So please help me in welcoming Dale to the program. Now, before we settle in, I've got a little bit of logistics to do for the recording here. Let's take a look and make sure the camera is aligned.
I'll just sit here awkwardly.
Oops. All right. Well, Dale.
Thank you. Do we want the, is that gonna stay up?
Yes, I'll put this back. Thanks.
Aunt lives there. And when Hurricane Michael came through with a 14-foot wave, people said, how did this happen? Well, you can see the ocean. What do you mean, how did it happen? And so recognizing that fact, that's the baseline. We can't get rid of the flood. Given that fact, what can we do to reduce your risk and understand the residual risk and damage that will happen.
Great, so let's talk about some of your personal experience before we get deeper into your professional experience. In 2018, you had personal experience with the devastating impacts of the storm surge from Hurricane Michael in Mexico Beach. So looking back at that experience, what are the lessons those of us here in Southwest Florida can take from the recovery efforts that storm, both in terms of what the community of Mexico Beach got right, and where they may have missed some opportunities to prepare better for the future?
Well, Mexico Beach is a very painful topic for me because I grew up going there. My entire family is South Georgia. I have a Southern accent. I don't know if you noticed. I'm from South Georgia. But I grew up going to Mexico Beach. It was a fishing town. It's where Grandma had her fishing cabin. And so most of the folks there were generational houses, did not have flood insurance. And that's the biggest thing that I saw in recovery was, how do we fix our house without insurance? And so my first thing is always, flood insurance is your first and best line to recover. And recognizing that just because you survive this storm doesn't mean the next one's not going to be worse. When Hurricane Matthew came up the East Coast, we had communities in Southeast Florida that said, oh, we survived a Category 4 hurricane, we're good. We had to clarify, no, you didn't. Just because Hurricane Matthew wasn't classed Category 4 at one time doesn't mean what you experienced was. So we had people who got tropical storm force winds, who then had a hurricane party during the next hurricane, and the ceiling collapsed and killed them all. I mean, this was a example that happened in Daytona Beach. And so recognizing that just because you've gotten through one storm, like Helene and Milton, doesn't mean that's as high as the water's going to get. And then with Hurricane Michael in Mexico Beach, the memory was very short. So right after Michael, the entire town was wiped out, and they paused. They did a moratorium on permits so they could figure out how to fix it, how to do well. Within 18 months, they got rid of their higher standards. They went from understanding that the entire city was susceptible to storm surge and building accordingly, to then caving to political pressure and allowing houses 4 blocks from the ocean to build back on the earth after 18 months, because it'll never happen again. And what they didn't recognize is that I don't need a 14-foot wave to come through my city to cause devastation. A 6-foot wave would do the same thing. And so I've got residents who lost everything in Mexico Beach, demanding the city commission let them rebuild to do it all over again. It was so bad that, given what I do for a living, I threw out a recommendation or offer on Facebook. They have a Facebook group there doing recovery. And I said, I'm here as a resource. I'm free, just use, if you need to have questions, I want to be involved. So I talked to the city commission, the mayors, residents, helping me navigate the insurance and recovery process as my mom and my aunt went through it. Right before Mexico Beach rescinded their higher standards, so they raised them and then went back. The moderator who worked for the city of that Facebook group blocked me from seeing the notice that they were going to reduce the standards because they didn't want my voice in the room. So, lesson learned? I don't know.
I hope so. I think that for this community, Hurricane Ian is still very fresh, which is why so many of us are here. So let's keep drilling down a little bit more here. You also have had some experience here locally in Lee County, both in the past and more recently on the heels of Hurricane Ian. Coming closer to home, what has been your experience with recovery with some of our neighbors that we?
Well, so I'm sure everybody heard about when FEMA tried to kick Lee County and Bonita Springs and everybody out of the program. Well, I'm a consultant for Lee County, and I've spent the previous year and a half talking to them about flood regulations and recovery. Nobody had a clue that FEMA was unhappy with them. And I won't go into details on that, but we did a rescue work, and we got, of the 5 communities, we got 4 out of hot water, we'll say. And it was a long process because FEMA was very, nationally, FEMA had received some backlash of basically rinse and repeat. Damage, rebuild, and some communities weren't following the rules, and it made headlines, and so here we have this case study of Wood County and 4 communities that were not following the rules, and the national newspapers got involved, and if I'd heard these articles, if I'd read these articles about a county in California, I would have said, oh, yes, absolutely, kill them. But I knew better, because I knew these floodplain matters. And so digging into how did we get there, the miscommunication from FEMA, the third costliest disaster in US history, things are gonna get missed. It wasn't perfect, but it's very different to go from you make mistakes to you're incompetent. And to navigate that, and I will say, I will not throw anybody under the bus, but I did consulting for Fort Myers Beach. I was a sub-consultant for them for several years. And after one of the storms, I was asked to come and talk and be interviewed on Beach Talk Radio and explain the 50% rule. So I came on to the radio program to explain it. And I very quickly realized nobody wanted me to explain it. They wanted me to tell them how to get around it. And over, everything I heard was, well, yeah, that's fine, but how do we stay under? How do we stay under? And I said, well, you're underwater. You're so focused on avoiding the 50% rule and building back better. And by the end of the conversation, I said, what would have happened in Fort Myers Beach if 30 years ago you had started elevating houses? And the DJ said, well, that wouldn't be Fort Myers Beach. And I pointed out the window and said, that's not Fort Myers Beach. What are you trying to protect? You lost everything. And here you are wanting to do it over again. And so by the end of that month, I had broken up that consulting relationship because I couldn't be part of it. So I have experience with folks wanting to do the right thing and not. And I'm the staff, and there were plenty of residents and staff who wanted to do the right thing. But the loudest voices were it won't happen again, we'll be fine. FEMA kicks them out, puts them on suspension, probation, and they have to get back, climb out of it. So I don't want to see that happen here.
Thank you for that. In that survey that I was talking about earlier, one of the questions we asked was, to what extent do you agree with the statement that you'd like to see Sanibel be a model of resilience as it relates to some of the adaptation things we'll be discussing tonight? We did 2 surveys, right? One 2 years ago, and one we just completed, and between 90 and 95% of the 1,000 respondents said they agree with that statement. So it's good to hear what we shouldn't do if we want to be that model. All right, again, we're kind of coming down into some more specifics here. So flood resilience strategies look different depending on the type of structure one's trying to protect and what the goals are. Here on Sanibel, while most homes are elevated, and according to code, we still have many grandfathered ground level homes, as well as many ground level businesses. So as we start to get into some of the specifics of consulting advice you might offer, can you educate us some on some of the terminology or concepts in flood protection and how those concepts should be prioritized? And if you want to use the slides, you can just push that front arrow with that.
We're back to video. Wait, as we're walking this, so when you're talking about flood, you have several factors. You've got standing water that gets inside and wets things and causes damage. And then you've got, there we go, okay. So you've got surge and you've got inundation. So on an island, we have surge coming from the ocean. That force of water pushing against things is very damaging. So that's one factor. And the other is just water damage, standing water, rainfall that gets inside your house. It's not moving, it's just making everything wet. So we have those 2 things. Waves, wave action, and then standing water. Well, of course, the options are to elevate it and get it above the water. But, are we going to elevate every house 20 feet off the ground? Or are we going to say 8 feet is good enough? And anything beyond that, we're going to accept the risk. And we have to understand the cost benefit. There's always gonna be a residual risk and where we're okay with the damage or, a certain storm causing damage. Now, as soon as that storm happens, they're gonna wish you had gone higher. But doesn't mean you're gonna build, Mexico Beach is not gonna build every house 19 feet off the ground. But 6 inches off the ground there's a big gap between there. Wet floodproofing is another thing. It's where you allow the water to get in and everything it touches is fine. It's concrete, it's flood resistant materials, it's not sheetrock. It's a lot of our products here. So when the water comes in and the water goes out, all you do is take a water hose and spray it off. You got, everything that's going to get wet won't get damaged. And then dry floodproofing is where you prevent the water from actually getting inside. You keep it out. Now, the thing with dry floodproofing is you can't build a wall tall enough that water won't eventually get over. I mean, the Mississippi levees are very good evidence of that. And so there's a balance between that. Once you put up a wall, when the water gets in, it can't get out. So those are kind of the three terminologies: elevate, wet floodproof, dry floodproof. Of course, elevating is the best thing. And then, for wet floodproofing, anything that can be damaged, get it above. Your electrical, your mechanical, if you're a business, a restaurant, what can you get above the flood level? And so that everything below that gets wet, won't be damaged. And then your dry floodproofing, of course, put a wall up to keep the water out, but recognizing that when it gets over top, now the water's trapped inside that wall.
All right, great. So let's look more closely at ground level as we get into some of the more specifics. So obviously, as you said, the best solution is to elevate, to get them above the floodwaters. And dozens of people here have actually done that or are in the process. But it's not always possible, and it can be cost prohibitive depending on your situation. Also, even people with elevated buildings may have grandfathered finish space on the ground floor or want to make cleanup of their garage or storage areas easier. So let's talk in more detail about what else can be done. If I'm the owner of a ground level building, what advice can you give me about what my options are to get ready for the next big storm or flood event? How can I reduce damage to my home and make it easier to recover from the damage I have? Let's start with that concept of wet flood treatment. What does that look like in practice?
Well, let me throw out a caveat before you move forward. One thing that popped in my head, and as a floodplain manager at the national level, I have to say, the best solution is not to build it. So, first of all, and there's a lot of discussion about managed retreat, leaving, but I've had people in Boston try to explain to me that St. Augustine should move. We're not going to move the oldest city in the nation. We're not going to abandon New Orleans. The odds of Sanibel going back to bare earth is probably very small. So, best solution, safest, is to move out of the way, get it out of the way. Notwithstanding that, it's elevated. So your ground level homes, what can you do? Well, if you've got a ground level home, let's say a 1-story, there's a lot of different options. I've seen homes convert that bottom level to a garage and then do a 2nd story on top. So now you're not elevating, but you're expanding your living space and getting your living space away from the damage. But of course, that has its own complications because most 1-story homes weren't designed, the walls weren't designed to hold a 2nd story. So there's structural engineering and reinforcement that has to happen. You've got the options of your typical sandbags for rainfall. I mean, I live in Orlando, and when Hurricane Ian came through, the whole world went underwater. And so a lot of the homes survived from sandbags. Storm surge and sandbags don't really play well together. So what does a 1-story home do? Getting as much elevated up as you can is an option, but at the end of the day, you can't remove the risk of a 1-story home on the ocean. So it's a very difficult scenario to navigate, but wet floodproofing, what happens when the water comes in? how do you reduce the damage there? And a lot of people have taken their garages and you'll store a lot of stuff in your garage and then, be confused when the flood comes in and destroys it all. And so understanding bring that a common sense conversation for a little bit. And a lot of times, we hear something, we see something that's a bumper sticker and it sounds great. But once we start talking about it, it falls apart very quickly. And so really just having that conversation about what happens when the water gets in here, what's going to get damaged, what is okay to lose. So do you have your important documents flood-proofed? Do you have that watertight container that your memories can go into? If when you evacuate, what's going to happen to your photo albums, your important documents, your insurance documents, that kind of thing. So being proactive to decrease the devastation of the damage. You can replace the couch. You can't replace grandma's baby picture. And so how do you step into it and say, all right, I chose to live here. I'm going to stay here. What can I do to reduce the damage to what's important versus things like TVs and couches that can be replaced? Yeah, I kind of want to tangent on this.
Yeah, let me focus you a little bit more on this idea. So, I think that for many of us, one of the first concerns we have when with water in the house is mold, right? And all of the people in the room, myself included, can also remember the magnitude of the muck that is everywhere after the surgery seated and the amount of work it was to get that stuff out of the house. So, if you're describing what you talked about, you close it down and it's, if you guys like, what if, assuming you get your valuables out of harm's way and you can, accept that your couch might be replaced, whatever. But what about your walls? What about your insulation? What about your floor? What are the materials that would allow that wet flood-proofing thing to be such that it's not as much of a disaster to come back from after a flood event occurs?
Well, and a lot of our vendors here have products that fit this need very well. But because of the way the regulations work, if you have to rip out your drywall and you don't cross 50% line, and you have to bring it into compliance with the regulations, you can put drywall back. Don't do that. Don't take the thing that got damaged and replace it with the same thing that will be damaged again. So what does it look like to say, as you're repairing or remodeling, take that drywall that will get wet and get damaged and replace it with a water resistant or waterproof material. You can, by the time you paint and you stucco or, whatever, it can look the same. When you redo your flooring, don't put carpet down. Your hardwood floors, these are kind of things that when you start talking about it, when water gets back in, what's going to get damaged? Well, don't use that. And I don't say that tongue in cheek. I don't mean to say that flippant. I understand that it's not that easy. But so often when we see repairs happen, homeowners go back in and they recarpet their house after a flood, or they put hardwood floors back in. When it happens again, it's going to be the same thing. So terrazzo, your concrete floors, block walls over wood, these kind of things that maybe you're not gutting your house and putting it back, but systematically you're replacing this and that. When you bring your cabinetry in, wood cabinetry versus a material that if it gets wet, it's not going to absorb the water. Little things like that over time can help you recover. The last thing we want is our wooden cabinets going to soak up that salty sludge water. Whereas if it's a different material, we can wipe it out and clean it out. And so slowly, I guess, eating the elephant one bite at a time for a lot of the homes.
Right. And if there are more specific questions, feel free to put them on your cards. We will have some time to come back.
And I do want to say, I'm not a contractor. I don't build houses. So when we get down in the weeds on some of these topics, I'm going to send you to our vendors. I mean, they're the experts in some of this stuff. I know enough to be dangerous about some of it and a lot about others. So I will be the first one to admit when I don't know about a topic.
Got it. Well, let's move on to keeping the water out of the house, dry flood proofing. What technologies are out there for flood barriers? Are they effective? Are they safe? What are the potential risks of using a flood barrier? Are there examples that you could give about what's worked, what's failed, and why? And what are the conditions under which it do make sense?
When you're talking about keeping the water out, the first thing you have to recognize is, will that violate your permit and the compliance of your house? So if you have a house that was built under the new code, it's elevated, and you have an opening at the bottom level that has flood openings in it, for example. Those openings are designed to let the water in and out. If you're in a wave action zone, that bottom level, the walls are designed to break away before your house gets pushed over. You can't put a flood barrier in front of those flood openings. That's a violation of the regulations. You've made your house non-compliant. You can't take the breakaway walls and make them not break away. You're violating the regulations. And the reason these regulations are there is because if you keep the water out, it's now putting more pressure on your house. And hydrostatic pressure, the pressure of standing water, is very strong. A cubic yard of water, so 3 feet high, weighs 1,700 pounds. That's a lot of force on the wall. And if your wall is supposed to break away, and you put something on it to keep it from breaking away, that force is now on your tiles in your house instead of flowing under it unimpeded. If you have flood openings in your walls, the water is supposed to get in so that it's equalizing itself. If you close those openings and you get 3 feet of water outside, now you're going to get damage. So that's the first thing. You can't put a barrier in place to make the house not do what it was designed to do. You also can't put up a barrier and leave. You know, I know we have some snowbirds here. The solution is not to provide flood protection before you go back north. That's a violation of the regulations. You can't do that. Because when you put up a barrier, the water's going to go somewhere. And when that barrier gets overtopped, if you've left the wall in place, the water can't get out. So now all you've done is saturate your house for 6 weeks. Also, if you put up a wall in front of a wave, if the wave bounces off the wall, it bounces against somebody else. So your diverted wave action is going to hit your neighbor's house. Your elevated house next to your one-story neighbor, you've now increased the force of pressure on their house. So as we're talking about these barriers, we have to recognize what sounds good versus what's illegal. So for your newer homes, if you have these openings, you have breakaway walls, you can't do anything that makes it non-compliant. But with these barriers, we've got a lot of products coming out, or a lot of legislation coming out. I just spent several weeks working with a couple of the senators in Tallahassee, trying to get some of the legislation about flood barriers fixed. Because if I'm going to put sandbags, which is a barrier, in front of my doors, I can do that without a permit. However, if instead of sandbags, I'm going to put a panel in my doorway, well, now I need brackets. I need something attached to the structure. As soon as I do that, that requires a permit. So I can sandbag it without a permit, but I can't attach a bolt and brackets without a permit. Because as soon as I do that, I'm attaching it to a wall that may or may not be strong enough to hold that water back. When you put in a barrier in your doorways and your windows, now the pressure is applied to your wall. And if some of your one-story houses here were built like they were next to a beach, it's concrete blocks sitting on a slab. And we didn't have rebar in our slabs. It doesn't take a lot of water to push that out of the way. And so the structural stability of the house is a really big key. You've got to have somebody who has the background and knowledge in to assess the potential damage of your product. When you keep the water out, the water stacks up and it's going to push on it. So there are inflatable flood barriers. We've all seen the pictures of the random farmhouse in Kansas on a dry island when Mississippi River levee breaks. That's great, but that's a house in the middle of nowhere. Their neighbors aren't being affected. But when we have a barrier here, temporary barrier, the water goes somewhere else. So it's all about getting an assessment and understanding what these barriers can do and what they can't do. 2 feet tall, maybe that's fine. A 4 foot tall, absolutely not. Because the pressure on that and the increased flood risk to your neighbors is complicated.
Right, I'm gonna ask you to clarify a little bit. You're talking about elevated homes that have floodgates, and they're designed to allow water to go through. They're designed to have breakaway walls so that, so you talk about that you should not put a flood barrier around them, because you're gonna sort of work against the way the thing is designed. But just to be clear, that is, if there is a flood barrier that is attached to the building, they keep water away from those breakaway walls, is that a viable consideration, or is that you're in an elevated home, you're probably not thinking flood barrier?
If you're in an elevated home, you should not be thinking flood barriers. If you look at the regulations from FEMA, they say that flood barriers are not allowed in wave action zones, in your coastal zones.
Because the way,
Because the waves are, the building is designed to let the waves in and out. And so as soon as you put that barrier up, you're violating the intent of the regulations. You can't dry flood-proof a residence, first of all. You can't design a residence to keep the water out and be compliant because there's health and safety factors there. If I put a wall around my house to keep the water out, I'm trapped inside that wall. With a business, you evacuate. With a house, we know you're gonna be in the house. So that's why you can dry flood-proof a business like this building, not a residential space. But you can't dry flood-proof your house, because then you're increasing life safety. And once you put those walls up, how do you get out? How do you climb over the wall into 4 feet of water? So if you got an elevated house, your solution is not to keep the water out. Your solution is to keep the damageable stuff out of the water. Your walls are designed to break away, they're supposed to break away. They're designed to let the water in and out, that's part of it. As soon as you try to stop that, you're violating it, whether you are connected to the building or you're stepping away from it. The keeping the water out piece is for your older homes. Your non-conforming homes. And non-conforming is, it means your house doesn't meet today's regulations. Doesn't mean it's a violation. Maybe you go in the 50s, or maybe the flood maps are older, we're older than you permitted. So these one-story homes or homes with living space in the bottom level, these are the homes we talk about keeping the water out. The newer homes, I know you don't want your car to get flooded, but the garage is designed to get flooded. So if you don't want your car to get flooded, move it. Don't block the walls.
Share the mic here for a minute. So, this is really helpful, I think. One of the things that I recently learned from somebody in the audience here who actually did some, flood barrier work for the condo group where he found this. We talked about, a thing called a flood mitigation certification. And we can talk a little bit about that, and then anything else before we move off the subject, like, are there, state guidelines that people need to be aware of, or engineering concerns that people could consider barriers we would be paying attention to all of that.
Well, so one thing to note is there's a lot of products out there, but not all of them are created equal. And so I want to steer you a little bit before we get on this path. When Hurricane Andrew came through South Florida, there were a lot of people rebuilding, which meant there was a big supply and demand problem for flood openings and all. And a couple companies out of South America were selling flood openings at Home Depot and Lowe's. And hundreds of homes use these flood ovens. Turns out they weren't flood ovens. They were poorly constructed air vents. But nobody knew, the homeowners, there's nobody monitoring it because thousands of homes are being rebuilt. So all these people who bought this product from Home Depot, and surely Home Depot has a valid product, wound up having finished construction homes that did not meet the regulations. And not only did they not meet the regulations, when the floodwaters came, those vents got clogged very quickly and did not operate. They didn't let the water in and out. Their foundations got damaged. So when you go to a store or you're looking at a product for flood protection, they are not all created equal. So that actually is why in the southeast Florida area, they passed a law, and this has gotten a lot more traction, where all flood vents have to be stamped. There has to be a stamp on the product so we know where it came from. Because you as residents, it's not your job to become experts. You know, you shouldn't have to become experts on flood vents to buy one that works. And so the goal is to eliminate that confusion and take it off your plate. If you're rebuilding your house, the last thing you be worried about is whether this flood vent is shaded or not. So with flood barriers, we've kind of gone the same path. Now, they're not all certified, but there are approvals, FM approvals, flood mitigation approvals. There's a lot of programs out there. As Bob mentioned, I was on the national board for the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and ASFPM has partnered with a couple groups to help identify flood barrier solutions and certify them that they meet the standards for ASCE 24, which is the American Society of Civil Engineers. It's their document that shows how to create flood-resistant houses. Basically, somebody's gone in and said, all right, here's the standards we can meet. Can we get a certification for that? Yes. So they started taking products, and just like you're not endorsing any of the sponsors, but they're here, they're partners. The goal is to put the certification on products to show that this meets this minimum standard, so you don't have to figure it out. Now, if you want to go to some of these barriers and hire an engineer and you don't have to certify it, you can do that. But the goal is to reduce that burden on the homeowner. And so what we're talking about here too is you're not allowed to put these flood barriers on a residential structure to be compliant. You can do it to non-commercial, non-residential structure. However, what can we use for the barriers in a short term to keep, protect our houses? So I can't dry flood-proof a house, but I can put sandbags to keep the water out. What can I do to keep the water out to protect my house that is different than being compliant? So if it sounds like we're talking out of both sides of our mouth at times, we are. But you can't do this. But if you did, here's how you do it. It's kind of the idea for the flood barriers. And if I change your question into something you didn't ask, please correct me, because I will do that.
Yeah, I want to start to get to some of the questions that you all have. And thank you. Many of you submitted questions in advance when you registered. So I got those in front of me. If you have a question that came up as you're discussing it, you can scan this QR code up here to do it with your phone, or just put your hand up if you want an index card. Or if you've already written an index card, wave the card if you've got a couple people to be picking this up. But I'm going to start with insurance. Okay, so please talk about insurance providers, pros and cons of insurance rates with flood barrier protectors. And then going back to Fort Myers Beach, there's a question, this question is about, is the city considering not allowing flood barriers here, similar to what Fort Myers Beach has told the homeowners there? So, feasibility insurance rate impact from available for the building.
So the flood insurance conversation has gotten more complicated in the last few years. Previously, so FEMA has changed how they do flood insurance. Previously, under the old system, it was in versus out. We pretended that a line on the map was going to stop the flood from happening. We basically approached it as if floods breathe maps. You're in the flood zone, you pay one thing, you're outside the flood zone, you pay something else. That doesn't work. And the FEMA has changed where they do flood insurance. Now it's just based on your overall risk of flooding, ignoring the FEMA maps, which seems contradictory. But FEMA's ignoring their own map when they're assessing how much you pay because the maps are broke, basically. The 100-year flood doesn't mean anything to an actual storm. It goes where it wants to go. And given in that context, the things you can do to reduce your flood damage, your flood insurance premium has changed. It doesn't matter whether you're in the AE flood zone, the EE flood zone, or the X zone. None of that relates to your insurance premiums. It determines whether you have to buy flood insurance or not, but it doesn't dictate your flood insurance rate. And so you can elevate your house, and that can reduce your flood premium. But if you're on a barrier island and they predict that your risk of flooding is complete demolition, and you elevate your house up a foot, and the analysis shows it's still going to be completely demolished, you don't benefit that much by that increase elevation. So that's why some of you are wondering, you've asked your insurance agent, well, what if I do this with low insurance? And they said, yeah, $3. But look, that doesn't make sense. Well, because, you know, if it's 7 feet of water knocks your house down, 6 feet of water may do the same thing. And so that's kind of that nuance there. But for insurance, your best, like I said earlier, your best method to recover from a storm is having flood insurance. There's the FEMA flood insurance and there's private flood insurance. And a lot of your private companies do FEMA flood insurance as well. So just because your policy is through State Farm doesn't mean it's not a FEMA policy. And they still get your policy. And if you've had flood insurance for years prior to FEMA changing, you're on what's called the glide path. So let's say you were paying $2,000 a year for flood insurance. You've been paying that for 20 years. Under the new system, your flood insurance may actually need to be 10 grand a year. But as long as you keep your insurance, you're going up 18% per year. And so 18% per year increase from 2,000 to 10,000 takes a while. But as soon as you drop your policy, if you go to get a new one, it's now 10 grand instantly. So maintaining your FEMA flood insurance policy is a very valuable thing. What you need to keep in mind though, is that if a private company says, hey, it's 3,000 with FEMA, I'll give it to you for 2,000, 1,500. As soon as you switch, if that insurance company goes underwater or keeps canceling your policy and go back to FEMA, it's now 10,000. When you leave FEMA, you lose the benefit of your glide path, even if you go to a private company. And we're trying to get that fixed. There's legislation in Tallahassee, or DC trying to get that fixed. So I'm just saying, a better deal isn't always a better deal long term. So just be careful when you start pushing back and forth.
And just to belabor this a little bit more, this question, I think there's a lot of interest in flood area. So this question was insurance with respect to flood area. Does it increase, decreases their benefit with the use of flood area?
Well, for residential flood insurance, no, because it's a non-compliant thing. You can't permanently put a flood barrier around your residential property, so it doesn't benefit the flood insurance. For a commercial property, like this building here, if we install flood barriers in the doors and we flood-proof the walls, that can decrease your flood insurance premiums. But for your house, no, because it's a temporary measure, and the insurance company and FEMA are not going to say, well, we know you're going to do this every single time, so we're going to use your flood insurance.
All right, let's shift to flood vents.
Oh, the Fort Myers Beach question.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So there's legislation in Tallahassee right now, as I mentioned, that we just finished the session. Next week, I'm going to debrief on what was passed. And so there's a back and forth about whether or not communities could require permits for temporary flood measures. And it's complicated. There's a lot to it. And so Fort Myers Beach has said they're not going to allow permitted flood barriers in their town, based on the article I saw and the published information there. And that's because the liability of putting up flood barriers in your house causes increased potential damage on the foundation. But once again, if I put flood barriers in your doors and your windows, the water is not gonna be 3 feet deep against your wall. And the wall was not designed to accommodate that. So rather than go down the process of having these houses certified by structural engineer, all that extra liability, the city has just, the town has said, no, we're not doing it. So, the city of Sanibel does not permit temporary flood measures for residential structure. So right now, you can sandbag and all, but it's not, they don't issue permits for it. That's different than they don't allow. And so that's still, we're navigating that. They don't issue permits for it. You can't apply for a permit to retrofit your house with flood barriers. I'm gonna blow up a wall right before the storm to keep the water out, like inflate the wall. It doesn't get permitted to the city. However, if whatever you're doing is making your house non-compliant, well, that's a violation. And so, when I'm talking to the city, if somebody puts a flood barrier around their house and they move back to Vermont, that flood barrier will get removed, you will get flagged, you will get fined. This is a violation of the local code.
Couple of this, just to add to your
I
point.
came with lots of good news.
To add about the permitting, if any of you have businesses in Sanibel, it's my understanding that businesses do need permits for.
Yes, yeah, businesses you can have flood barriers for businesses, any non-residential building. You can get a permit for flood barriers and they're required. And so that is a very viable and, recognized solution for your businesses.
All right, actually, before we get to flood events, I've got some questions coming in that relate here. So one of the things that, I've been thinking about today or really wanted to expand on is this idea of the differentiation, from storm surge or severe storm surge and something else. So, in Sanibel, we have 12 feet of surge, right? So flood barriers are probably, even if you have a good use case, they're not gonna help you out. But Ian and Milton were, more moderate. So like what, if you're thinking about some kind of a barrier, like what's the height, that is realistic for you to be thinking about, like, so where does it become more of a liability?
Well, most of the guidance out there, and as I'm looking at the audience, I keep looking at my other fellow consultants and suppliers I'm looking for nods from a few of the folks out here to make sure I'm not saying anything, I missed anything here. But a lot of the guidance and regulations and the rules out there will restrict it at 3 feet or more for just because of structural damage potential. And so think about, like I said, a cubic yard of water weighs 1,700 pounds. That's 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. 3 feet of water pushing on your house is a lot of force. And so most of the guidance out there stops at 3 feet. Because anything beyond that, we get into some real structural issues. And so if I had a house here, for me, I'm thinking stacking up sandbags on the other side of a tarp 2 feet deep is probably about as far as I'm gonna go. Now the waves and standing water do different things. But in my house in Orlando, when the whole world went underwater, I felt comfortable putting 2 feet of sandbags with a tarp against my door to kind of keep the water out. But anything beyond that, a 1920s house in Florida was not designed to resist the force of water. And so when you're doing this, just keep in mind, when you keep the water out of your house through your door, the pressure is going somewhere else. And there's really not a one size fits all answer to this. The difference in how water behaves on every storm is part of the problem. Water never flows downhill twice the same way. And so when you have a storm surge coming up the beach to your house, it's going to hit one way, and Helene is going to hit another way. And so what works today isn't going to work tomorrow. And when the storm's just a little bit higher, a little bit deeper, a little bit stronger, plus the wind is blowing a little bit harder, now everything's different. Or you put it up your sandbags, and then somebody who's sightseeing drives their big 4x4 truck down your street, and that 2 feet of water is now 2.5 feet or 3 feet because of the wave action from the trucks driving down. And so, I was the guy in Orlando standing out in my waders, yelling at trucks to turn around because you had neighbors who the water was out of their house, and this big truck came through, and you watched the neighbors just crumble as the water had keep out, went inside their house with their neighbor was in a pump. Because their kids wanted to see the flood. So don't sightsee during a storm, please. It's not helpful for your neighbor. Or watching businesses where the windows were open until the semi truck came down the street and pushed the water up, and all of a sudden you see the windows pop, 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 pop. Because a semi truck decided that he could make it through and it would be fine, ignored the damage he thinks it was made.
All right, flood events. Got a lot of questions.
Tangent.
Got a lot of questions here, and they all kind of sum up to, is it wise to cover them up?
What you're doing is illegal. We say that right off the bat. Why? First of all, you can't. You cannot cover flood vents because they are there, they were permitted, they're designed to let the water in and out. So first of all, it's illegal. Second of all, if you get damaged from the flood because you cover the flood vents, your insurance will not cover it because you violated the regulations in your insurance. Also, it's not wise because you are keeping the water out. And if the water can't get in and equalize the pressure, it's now pushing on the wall. And that wall was not designed to resist that damage. So it is not wise, it is not legal, it is not allowed, and it will invalidate your insurance policy.
Very well. Good to have an answer that's not ambiguous.
And if you've got leather couches and plasma TVs in your room that has flood vents, that is not okay either. Your man caves and your she sheds cannot be behind the flood vents, because that is not limited storage, that is living space. Even knows what you're doing, and your flood insurance will not cover it.
All right, yeah, no, you hit on one of my pet peeves, after seeing mountains of couches and mattresses and what have you in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian. All right, but related to this whole issue of like, you block the vent, create pressure. There's a question here about, what about impact windows and doors? Are those also concerned in the same vein if you're looking at that in the lower level of the house? Is the pressure, is that an issue as well, or is there enough other space that's dispersing that?
Well, with your impact windows and doors, that's part of the permitting process. So when you get a permit for replacing your windows with impact resistant windows, the analysis is supposed to be done by an engineer to verify that not only is this going to resist the wind damage, it's going to resist the flood damage. In the ASC 24, which is the flood design for flood resistant buildings, it talks about the combined loads, the combined impacts. So if it's permitted, the engineer, the architect, whoever designed your house was required by the Florida Building Code to look at both the impact of wind and flood, storm surge as well. So if you have appropriately permitted flood resistant or impact windows and impact resistant doors, they are supposed to be and should be designed to resist the flood damage as well. So it shouldn't cause a problem. If you go out on a Saturday and replace your windows illegally, that's not okay.
Here's another related question. So question is, does boarding of the windows and doors on a one-level home you can buy with constitute a violation? Is it a flood area?
No and no. I mean, putting up your storm shutters and your plywood, the storm shutters gotta get through the permitting process, because you're attaching something permanently to the building. But boarding up your windows, no, that's not a violation, it's not gonna cause an issue. However, one thing I wanna say, please stop taping your windows during hurricane. When you put duct tape or some kind of tape on your windows, anything that keeps the glass from shattering, all it actually does is create bigger pieces of glass. And so that glass that would have shattered and created debris now shatters and creates giant triangles of death. And so this whole duct taping X's on your windows, stop it. All you've done is create more deadly debris. So either board it up or let it shatter. But I mean, in Orlando, I saw everywhere, people just duct taping the windows. And this is bad. Because when that shatters, that duct tape piece of glass is coming at you. And instead of pieces, it's now a triangle. Yeah, so it's not even the same thing.
All right, we're gonna just do a little diversion to another topic here, which this has also been of interest to a lot of people. And that is their swimming pool. A lot of us have had flooded pools multiple times over these last few years, and certainly I think a number of people have, elevated pool pumps and pool equipment. But what is there to do with the pool? There's the flood barrier, for example, is that an application for a swimming pool? Or, what kind of insights can you share with folks looking at the pool?
So one thing I've mentioned quite a few times is the pressure of water, hydrostatic pressure, the pressure of waves. One thing I haven't mentioned is buoyancy. Anytime you get water around something, it wants to float up. Okay, this room is full of water, you care to float because of buoyancy. So if you keep the water out of an area, the thing it's around is trying to lift versus the weight of it. And you get enough buoyancy to pop a slab up. And so not only are you creating pressure on the outside, you're creating force to try to lift up your slab, lift up your house. You know, a 4-foot block that the water's on the outside and not the inside is trying its best to get up and float. Pools are the same way. And so as you keep the water outside of your pool, the pressure of the water out here is pushing up on the bottom of the pool as well. So you may keep the sand out and the salt water out, but I've seen over and over where pools on the beach pop up. Hotel pools, we've seen so many of them where they just pop up, and a big concrete pool that pops up causes a lot of damage. And so as you're looking at this, just keep that in mind. And my thing would be, how do you retrofit your pool with things that are permanent that keep the damage in? So your pool pumps, you can design a pool pump that will not be damaged when it gets submerged. They're not as cheap as the other ones, but you can't always elevate a pool pump up because it won't work. You get a pump high enough, it's going to stop working. A lot of your intake valves, you could, there are retrofits where you can actually install things that will keep the water from going in, the sand from going in. Now, how do you keep the sand and salt out of your pool itself? I'd say we have bigger fish to fry. But I understand cleaning all that sand out of your pool, especially when the entire thing is full of sand after you storm. I understand the problems there. But it's a very difficult problem to fix. I mean, I don't know, a tarp that keeps the sand out, that lets the water in. There's a lot of things that you can do to the pool, but as soon as you keep all the water out of the pool, you're really risking a pop-up of the buoyancy. And that'll be a little more expensive to fix than the sand.
All right, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. We're getting to the end of our time. One of the questions submitted ahead of time was sort of, within the ideal world scenario. So if you were to build a modest, hurricane-resistant, 3-bedroom home from scratch, what would key design elements to ensure resiliency against future storms and flood risks. Just combined with that, a question about a homeowner with a, home with code, what is the recommended elevation of the home? How do you sort of decide how high it should be? So kind of combining that into the ideal design scenario.
Well, first recommendation is put the house in Orlando on a hill. Barring that, I would say, first of all, do not look at FEMA's elevation, the flood elevation, and consider that means anything. Because FEMA's elevation is the bare minimum that somebody 50 years ago, like FEMA's flood maps were made to assess the risk of insuring that property. If I'm going to insure it, I need you to be at least here so that my investment in your insurance policy is sound. It had nothing to do with keeping you undamaged. We have inherited that National Flood Insurance Program as the floodplain management program, as the flood mitigation program. But you can't start with an insurance program and it actually translate into a damage reduction program effectively. Your health insurance and the requirements for health insurance are not going to keep you healthy. They're going to be enough to keep you alive. Yes, and maybe not that. So that's one of the biggest things is when you look at the elevations, FEMA's minimum is not good enough. And I've heard this over and over. Why can't we just do the bare minimum from FEMA? Because it's the bare minimum. We don't live on a bare minimum risk zone. The Sanibel Island is not a bare minimum risk. Even with the floodability code requires an extra foot. That is still a bare minimum. Designing a house on Sanibel to the same level as a house in Kansas doesn't make sense. But that's what the +1, that's what the design requirements say. And so when you're looking at what's an ideal elevation, look at the historical impacts, but note that the storm is getting worse. And so for me, I know Anna Maria is a client of mine, and everything that the city of Anna Maria, regardless of FEMA's flood elevation, is a minimum elevation of 12. And they have a lot of flood elevations with 7s, 8s, and 9s. They don't care. Everything's a 12 at least or higher. Longwood Key has got a 3-foot freeboard in a lot of their coastal areas, whereas FEMA says 1's good enough because they know the risk is higher on the ocean. So, but if I'm doing a modest 3-story home or a 3-bedroom home, elevating it up, for me, I would not be any closer to the ground than 11 or 12 feet for me. If I was going to build a house, I want the ability for a 10-foot wave to go under my house and not cause damage, because it's going to happen. Also, instead of having features like storm shutters, I have permanent fix. Anything that requires me to do a task before the storm's coming to make my house safer is just destined to fail. When I put the storm shutters, where's that last bolt? Or, this one's rusted, or I can't quite get it in. We gotta go. I don't have time. You never have enough time to do that. So storm resistant windows, storm resistant doors that are they're always there, or I can just close the door. So I would remove any kind of manual intervention task that you have to have. I would also have a list of things that I'm storing in my garage that are legal to store there, but I want to move out of the way. So what's your go bag? My screwdrivers and the tools and all that is stay. But my leaf blowers go into the room. Those, what are the things you want to quickly get out of the way? What is a floating hazard? Do I have shelves in my garage that are going to tip over? We'll pull them to the wall. So those kind of things, figuring out, all right, I built my house, I've got a risk, what's acceptable? What are my solutions for when the storm's coming to be quickly, knowing that you will be frantic And you're gonna have to help your neighbor who's 900,000 years old hang up her shutters. And so-and-so's dog is loose, and you help me chase the dog down. So now your 4 hours of prep time is 35 minutes. And it always happens, something's gonna happen. But there's a house next to a beach that was featured in a documentary called The Last House Down. And in Hurricane Michael, that house got a cracked window and that was it. However, it was built at 3 times the dollars per square foot as anybody else's house. So if you have enough money, you can build a tank. But he could have saved some money and probably still been just as good. So at some point in time, what is the cost benefit value there? So for me, I would get the house up at least 10 feet off the ground, and then flood resistant materials or impact windows, impact doors. And I would not build my house out of wood. Period. A wood frame house in Florida is destined to fall down. There's a reason Miami-Dade, southwest Florida doesn't allow anything but masonry. No matter how strong your wood frame house is, no matter how many connections you make, no matter what you do, it is not going to be as strong as a masonry house. So my house would not be built out of wood. And the wood industry would say, you're wrong, it's fine. But I would build mine out of masonry. A metal roof, not a shingle roof, the shingle could fall off.
Last few questions. So let's go back to the wet flood piece, okay? So this is, I think, a really important question. If I install a drywall substance, something that's waterproof, will the water seep behind the wall? Will mold grow behind the waterproof wall? And if so, what's there to be done about that?
Well, it can, and that's the part of the design, is you have to make sure that as you're putting in this flood resistant material, that the cracks and the crevices are also designed appropriately. I can put in plastic sheeting, but as soon as the work is behind it, you have a problem. So making sure that the flood resistant material is sealed appropriately or is able to dry out effectively. And that's something that your designer is going to have to incorporate into it. But here's the question you need to ask. Because a lot of times you've got, there are some really good contractors and builders in Florida. And there are some really bare minimum contractors and builders in Florida. And I've dealt with it over and over and over. A lot of my clients are focused in Small Boat Key, Permanent Beach, Ponce Inlet, and Maria. And you've got developers that come in from somewhere else in Florida, and they build a house at the coast the same way they build it in Jackson or in Orlando. The risks are not the same. Or they build it to bare minimum part of building goes in with people. And so not all contractors are the same. And Bob said, not this Bob. So-and-so says his contractor was great, had a great experience. And that's probably good in the storm covers. And so not always relying on the contractor to have all the answers. And I know that, you're building a house and kind of retrofit it, you want to rely on the experts. But the person you're hiring to do a project, a lot of times has a conflict of interest in giving you what you need versus what you want. Because if what you need is going to cost more money versus what you want, the chance of you going to somebody else is higher. And so if I need you to spend $12, but you only want to spend $8 and you go to somebody else, there's a conflict of interest for me to try to do it for 10, try to do it for 9. And so really become your best advocate for that. And I know I changed your question to something you didn't ask, but with these flood resistant materials, the water will get behind them unless it's designed appropriately. And so recognizing that there are products that are mold resistant that can be part of the process, can be part of that design. But making sure the entire system is flood resistant and damage resistant, not just the thing you can see.
And this may not be practical in the living space, but I do know, you know, for people who have storage areas, garage areas, I've, people who put up water resistant material in such a way that it can come down after a storm, let it dry out, and then put it back up, take the insulation out, put it back, foam insulation, that kind of thing. So, with a lot of experience in this room, I encourage people to share their ideas with each other. So I'm going to just do two more questions. I want to touch on home elevation a little bit more. And then, last question around sort of, we talk a lot about, home, single family homes, but there are a lot of people who live in condominiums, anyway, so when it comes to commercial buildings, a little bit over the end, but, for home elevation, sort of the blunt question, is it worth the money?
So there's a common misconception in Florida that you can't elevate most homes. That is incorrect. I've seen any home can be elevated if it's done by the right person, first of all. I don't care if it's on sand, I don't care if it's a concrete block home, it can be elevated. I've seen videos and I've seen evidence. I've seen somebody take a 3-story colonial house with brick and 3-story columns out front. It was built 200 years ago and elevated it. It took them a month and they elevated it little by little, but they elevated it up, a historic home. There are contractors in Florida who would say, so you can't elevate a block home, or you can't elevate a wooden home. That's inaccurate. They can't do it is different than somebody else can't do it. You go to New Orleans, they'll say, hold on here. And they're elevating every home you can think of. And they've got contractors. There's a company in New Jersey, Estate Hall. There's not a home they can't elevate. And so there is a way to elevate your home. Now, is it cheap? No. It may not be cost effective, which is why I said, some solutions where you take the bottom level, you shore up your walls, and you build a second floor on top of it. But Jefferson Parish, which is City of New Orleans, parish around there, they have a requirement. They will not, the Jefferson Parish funds most of their elevation projects through grants. They will not pay more than $200 a square foot. There are contractors who say it costs $310. They say buy. And they have not found a single home they can't elevate because they have found the contractors who can do it, who know how to do it for the right price. Now, if you want to find somebody to elevate your house for $5,000 a square foot, you can buy it. But see, so elevating your house, it may not be cost effective. However, what is the cost of rebuilding it once it's damaged, rebuilding it from scratch? Compare that to the cost of elevating. Especially with this Elevate Florida program, the grant funding that's coming through, that's a very valuable program, and very viable. There are 1,000 people asking for every spot. So it's gonna take a while to get everything out there. There's always so much money in the fund. But it's a very viable solution. And if it's gonna cost you, $10 and you get grants for 4, then maybe that gets you closer to this elevation project. So is it worth it? Yes. Is it worth the money and investment? That's something you have to decide. But always think about what is the unforeseen cost. When you look at flood mitigation, which is reducing the flood damage, that for every dollar you spend, you save $6 in damage recovery. And that is the national improvement across the board. So the dollars you spend to keep the house from being damaged will save you $6 after the storm, as a general national average.
All right, I want to get people back to the expo here, but one last question, as I mentioned, around commercial or properties in particular. And so, talk about flood barriers, not making sense, or not even being, a flooding regulation for elevated homes. But the it make a difference in a 10-story condo, versus a home as it relates to, storm barriers, it was for flood barriers, for protecting it? And this may be a hard question to answer, but does the water mitigation wall work between the condo involved in the cases of the flood?
Well, for a condo building, if the bottom level is all non-residential, so it's just the offices and that kind of thing, then the bottom level could be drop footprint, a bare system could be installed if it was permanent. But if you've got residential space on the bottom level, then it can't be, you can't have a permanent flood barrier system installed, because it violates the regulation. But going in and installing a temporary measure, but once again, in a storm surge situation, putting that flood barrier around it, you now have deflected waves, that are going somewhere else. You have a wall that's going to hold the water in when it gets over. And remember, when you've got a storm surge, it's also raining 99 out of 100 times. So it's not just the wave you're keeping out. As soon as you put that wall around, the rain that's dropping has nowhere to go. And so imagine Fort Lauderdale, when they had that 24 inches of rainfall, that dropped in, what, 3 hours? It's a very short amount of time. If you had a storm surge situation where the hurricane was dropping that much rain, a lot of times the rain that's falling gets trapped behind the wall, is going to cause more damage than that 2-foot storm surge. And so recognizing the balance of that, is key. And for a lot of your condos, as long as the retrofitting of, hurricane resistant windows and doors to keep the wind and the rain out of your space is going to be the first line, first solution, first practical solution. However, if the people above you don't do that, the rain in their unit comes into your unit. So, yeah, and so you're only as good as your weakest link in a condo situation. I've got a friend of mine, their parents had a condo, south of here, and they owned a unit on the 3rd floor and the 1st floor. They sold the 3rd floor unit and stayed on the 1st floor unit. And of course, the hurricanes came through and they lost everything. But their mobility was limited, so the 1st floor was easier. And so as you're kind of navigating these decisions, it's a very complicated situation. You got 100 folks in the same space, and only 4 or 5 of them are doing the right thing. You get shrapnel from your neighbors.
All right, well, we're going to wrap up this part of it. As Del mentioned earlier, there's a lot of expertise in these businesses that are out in the corridor here. Many of them wanted an opportunity to present to you, but we could only do so much presenting in one forum. But go talk to these folks and get more specific ideas. And let me get, let's give a round of applause for that.
Well, some of the questions, I know I didn't answer all the questions, I didn't use solutions for everything, and it's not for lack of wanting to, but some of the problems just can't be solved.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Good job, Bob.
Yeah, excellent. Just a question. Board with the plywood. Last year when, we thought the Canadian wood was gonna be really expensive, I went out and bought 12 boards. To board out my windows. So now Bill was stuck with all this.